From Microbe TV, this is Beyond the Noise, episode number 16, recorded on September 13th, 2023. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and joining me today is your host, Dr. Paul Offit.
Hi, Vincent.
This is the video version of Paul's column on Substack called Beyond the Noise, cutting to the chase on important health topics. Today, I'd like to take a closer look at Paul's column, The Freedom to Harm. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. So, Paul, I'm vaccinated. What do I care if other people don't get vaccinated?
Right. When people say to me, what is the worst thing that an anti-vaccine activist can say to you? It's when they say, hey, you're vaccinated. What do you care whether I'm vaccinated or not? And the answer to that is twofold. First of all, even if you're vaccinated, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a 0% chance of being infected. I mean, no vaccine is 100% effective. So vaccines dramatically lessen but don't eliminate your risk of being infected. But more importantly, not everybody in this country can be vaccinated. There's about 9 million people who, because they're immune compromised, can't be vaccinated. They depend on those around them to protect them. And when herd immunity wanes, those viruses come back, and those people are especially at high risk. So we are responsible for our neighbor, even though I think, sadly, many of us don't feel that way.
So many anti-vaxxers tell me there's no proof that herd immunity is actually a thing. So what do I say to them, Paul?
I think there's probably no better example than measles. I mean, the most contagious of the vaccine-preventable diseases. So before there was a vaccine in 1963, every year there would be 3 to 4 million cases of measles. There'd be about 48,000 hospitalizations and 500 deaths. And then the measles vaccine started to be given. And it was universally taken up for the most part, although there were people whose parents who chose not to get it. So you saw clearly a decline. And then what happened is between 89 and 91, there were outbreaks of measles. And so much so that there were tens of thousands of hospitalizations and about 120 deaths between 89 and 91. And so what the government did was they recommended now a second dose. So you had a second dose, which really ended up being a second chance to get a first dose, because many of the people during those outbreaks never got their original dose. And with that, we eliminated measles from the United States by the year 2000. This highly contagious disease was eliminated by the year 2000. So then what happened? Then what happened is people got complacent. They thought, I don't see measles. Measles is no big deal. And so there's been an erosion in vaccine rates. And with that, there's been an increase in cases. I mean, there were outbreaks of measles in Alaska or Los Angeles, where there was a real attempt to enforce school vaccine mandates. And with that, those outbreaks subsided. So vaccines work. I mean, when I was a pediatric resident, we would see a case of invasive Haemophilus influenza B disease every week as a cause of meningitis or sepsis or pneumonia. Now that bacteria is virtually gone. Vaccines work. It is amazing to me that people question that. Polio, it was raged in the 40s and the early 50s. Then we had a polio vaccine and virtually eliminated polio from this country. I don't understand the question.
So in 2000, when we had eliminated measles, roughly what was the immunization coverage in the U.S.? Was it 100%?
No, it was about 94%.
So there were quite a few people not immunized, yet they did not develop measles. And presumably that's the herd immunity effect, right?
Exactly right. So in other words, that you get a critical percentage of the population that is immune, and that then severely restricts the capacity of that virus to spread from one person next. So occasionally, although we'd eliminated measles by the year 2000, measles would still come into this country. People from other countries with measles would come into this country, but it would not spread from American child to American child because we had a critical level of protection. Polio, same story. I mean, there was an outbreak of polio in a Connecticut school back in the 70s, I think in Greenwich, Connecticut, but it was a Christian Science school that didn't vaccinate. So many children in that school got actually paralyzed, and obviously far more were just infected. Never spread to the surrounding community because the surrounding community was vaccinated.
So you just said, vaccines work, and we don't dispute that. But one of the anti-vaxxer talking points is kind of exemplified by someone who made a comment in your version of this column, I wish we actually knew if vaccines caused autism, developmental delays, immune compromise, all this stuff. People still believe that this is an issue. So how can we tackle that?
I think we can tackle it the way we've tackled it, which is when, for example, Andrew Wakefield raised the question of whether the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine could cause autism with a paper he published in The Lancet in 1998. Very quickly, large retrospective epidemiological studies were done trying to see whether those who got a vaccine were at greater risk of autism than those that didn't. And that convinced a lot of people, a lot of parents of children with autism, who then saw those studies or heard about those studies. We went from probably 85 to 90% of parents of children with autism who thought the vaccine did it to closer to 10 to 15%. But there still is that 10 to 15%. So if the question is, how can we convince that 10 to 15%? I don't think we can. I think they hold on to this belief with the strength of a religious conviction, and there is no shaking that.
All right. So recently, Mississippi took a step backwards. Tell us about that.
Right. So Mississippi and West Virginia were the only two states that only had medical exemptions to vaccination. They didn't have a religious exemption. They didn't have a philosophical exemption. And as a consequence, interestingly, at that time, they were two of the highest states in terms of not only vaccine coverage, but the prevention of vaccine-preventable diseases, even though those two states are not necessarily known for their public health achievements. But there's been now a pushback against states that don't have a religious exemption, and that's what happened. What happened is that there was an anti-vaccine group that basically introduced litigation to put in place a religious exemption to vaccination. And the anti-vaccine group considers a major achievement that they now have that. Interestingly, it was not a religious group. It was not a religious group that said, I want to have a religious exemption to vaccination. It was an anti-vaccine group, because I would argue that a religious exemption to vaccination is a contradiction in terms. I mean, religions teach you to care about your children, care about your family, care about your neighbor, to take responsibility for being a member of society. I think that a choice not to get a vaccine based on religious grounds is an incredibly unreligious thing to do. I mean, you said it on this program before, that public health is about caring about society, and that's what religion also teaches you. So they should be, in theory, aligned with each other.
What was the actual argument made in the court that they should allow religious exemptions because it's their right?
Pretty thin. It was, well, there are medical exemptions, so why should that be any different than a religious exemption? That was essentially the argument, which is amazing that ever got through. I think that the group that opposed that tried to make sure the religious exemption stayed in place, just either wasn't paying attention or didn't do a very good job, because there's no reason that should be allowed to happen. I mean, I'm not a particularly religious person, but I was certainly, I wrote a book called Bad Faith, When Religious Belief Undermines Modern Medicine. And in the writing of that book, I became very close to a woman named Rita Swan, who was a Christian scientist who had sort of watched her son die of Haemophilus influenza type B meningitis because she chose prayer instead of antibiotics. But in my dealing with her for the many months I dealt with her in the writing of that book, she sort of opened my eyes to the fact that, religions teach you to care about children. I mean, she was Christian, and she said, Jesus cared about children. I mean, if you look sort of historically, interestingly, if you take Christianity as the original religion we're talking about, at the time of Jesus' life, child abuse was the crying vice of the Roman Empire. That wasn't him. I mean, if you believe that what is written in the Bible is close to what actually he said, I mean, what he said, he cared about children. He believed children had souls. He believed children could go to heaven. He said, verily I say unto you, and as much as you have done it to one of the least of my brethren, you have done it to me, right? Matthew 25:40. I mean, he stood up for children. It was the first Christian empire was the first one to actually stand up for children. When children were taken away from their parents at the border, the southern border in the United States, it was Christian relief societies that went then there to help the children. Religion stand up for children, and putting children in harm's way in the name of religion doesn't make any sense. And I think it's just how we are in this country. The minute you say, this is my religious belief, everybody stands back. No one dares challenge you. But I think this is an incredibly unreligious thing to do. And what will happen, no doubt, is people who aren't religious will choose a religious exemption, and the immunization rates will lower, lessen, and then you may see that some vaccine-preventable diseases coming back, and thus once again putting children in harm's way, because it's always the most vulnerable among us who suffer our ignorance.
Yet there are some religious organizations that say you shouldn't put foreign things into your body, and that they do have anti-vaccine stances, right?
Yeah, I would argue that viruses and bacteria are also foreign things that you shouldn't put into your body.
Well, of course, and alcohol and cigarettes and everything else, right?
Right.
So it doesn't make any sense. That's why people say to me, well, my religion doesn't permit me to take a vaccine, yet you can do everything else in life. It doesn't make any sense to me. I can see what you've just said, which is that the anti-vax movement has hijacked the religious exemption. Okay, I get that. But for religious organizations, there are all kinds of examples of pastors in different places telling their congregations not to be vaccinated. And I don't get it. Why?
I don't get it either. I think it's an unreligious act. This woman who I dealt with, Rita Swan, she sort of opened my eyes to all that. I mean, to Jesus and what Jesus said, at least this aspect of the religion, and just that she felt that it was the opposite of what it is religion taught her.
So the U.S., as we've said many times in the last few episodes, wants to be able to choose whether they're vaccinated or not. But many other countries already offer that choice, and still vaccination rates are high. For example, in the Netherlands, there's no vaccine mandate, yet over 95% of parents choose to vaccinate the children. Why is the U.S. so different? I don't have any faith that it would be over 90% here, do you?
No, I think it's who we are. I think maybe it's because the country was founded on the basis of individual rights and freedoms, and we choose the individual over society. But I think that's what this is all about. I think my sister has spent the last 30 years of her life in England, so her children were raised in England, and her son, who's now in his early 30s, says now he's been in this country for a while working in New York, and he said he's amazed actually at how individualistic people are in this country, how we don't think in terms of society ever. It's always about individual trumping society.
Well, public health, again, is about helping others, and we do have strong public health in this country. So there's some people who care about others, right?
There are many people who care about others, and you do hear those voices out there, and they often get drowned out, sadly, by these voices, that are arguing like the your commenter there that, here vaccines cause autism, so why should I be compelled to get a vaccine? And I think if vaccines actually caused autism, I could actually at some level understand that, but it doesn't cause these things.
Right. No, I interviewed Marion Koopmans for the last TWIV, right? Wonderful public health person in the Netherlands. And someone wrote in the comments, I wonder how much she's being paid to say those things. And it's maybe people can't understand that there are public health people who really care about other people's health. And that's why they do what they do.
And there are doctors who care about other people's health. And
for sure.
Devote themselves like you did, to try and understand viruses, who care about other people's health. But the minute that you say something that is opposed to what they believe in, then there must be some nefarious motive, right? I mean, you must be something, because we're a cynical, litigious society, and much worse than we used to be, I think.
So you note in the article that there's going to be similar litigation in other states, including New York, which is where I am right now. So do you think eventually every state will have a religious exemption?
I predict there'll be an ebb and flow. So for example, in California, when there was that sort of massive measles epidemic in 2014, 2015, that precipitated Richard Pan, who was a state senator, to introduce Senate Bill 277, which then eliminated the philosophical exemption. So that became then the third state that only had a medical exemption because of that massive outbreak. And it wasn't the first. I mean, there was a big whooping cough outbreak that occurred in California in 2010. So this was the second of a 1-2 punch. And so that was it. And now there'll no doubt be pushback. But because of that, because of eliminating that philosophical exemption, immunization rates in California rose, which is what you would have expected. So I think we'll just see this ebb and flow, and there will be children who will suffer when we're at the nadir, and then children will be hospitalized, and children may die, and then we'll be up in arms again and say, well, look, we really need to enforce these mandates because we can't trust our neighbors, sadly, that in a better world, we wouldn't need mandates. I mean, people would see that vaccines work and are safe, and you wouldn't need to have a mandate. But There's so much bad information out there that causes people to make bad decisions, that put them and their people who they come in contact with at risk, that we do sadly need mandates. I mean, and so I think it'll be an ebb and flow, as a guess.
You say in the article that in Mississippi, they said it's their biggest legal victory, but I would counter that vaccines are our biggest victory against infectious diseases.
This was hardly a victory for children. I mean, allowing children's parents to not vaccinate them, no doubt, not for religious reasons, but just because they can, using a religious excuse, will, I think, only put more children at risk. It was a sad day for children. And I think it wasn't recognized really for how sad it really was, because Mississippi, in many ways, along with West Virginia, were a beacon. They were the first two that never yielded to these kinds of exemptions. And largely, they were making an argument, I think it was a 14th Amendment argument, that they were saying that it's not that children should, or the people, the equal protection under the law, and so even children should have equal protection under the law, including if their parents are putting them in a risky situation, that they still deserved equal protection. I think that was the argument made against religious or philosophical exemptions in Mississippi, but now it got overturned. I think largely because they just didn't adequately oppose it.
Yeah, that's a good argument, saying the child should have a say, right? I like that.
Right. They should be protected by a government that, in theory, protects those who can't protect themselves.
All right. We'll put a link to that column in the show notes. That's Beyond the Noise with Dr. Paul Offit. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Vincent.